Here and share to you some of the results that I have from my research, which is basically about speech perception. We study speech perception in the brain and how it actually works. But before doing that, I just would like to ask your help to perform a really short experiment. So if everyone is with me right now, I will just ask you to close firmly your eyes and then imagine yourself in the middle of an open field and looking into the sky. You suddenly see a fast, flying, huge, completely naked pink elephant. So while looking at this beautiful creature, ask yourself how my voice was able to put that image into your mind, or even better, how your brain was able to extract that information from the stream of my voice. Now you can open your eyes. So this is actually what we call a speech. So a speech is a really unique human trait that is continuously evolving. It's an emerging property of the human brain, and it has a really important role in society as well as in the daily living. So without that, you were not able to sit here and try to get something new for your daily life. But in rare occasions, speech is actually being present in isolation, like the way you are hearing to me right now. Usually speech is being presented in a mixture of irrelevant background noise, but still your brain is able to extract the relevant information out of that mixture of information. How exactly does the brain extract this information is something that we don't really understand yet, but we are working hard on that problem. We know that there are some relevant brain structures that play a role in the perception of speech, and there are also some relevant oscillations, so how the different neurons in the cortex actually fire up and create oscillations in the cortex. So in order to be all in the same line, I'm just going to briefly mention them to you. So here you can see the left brain hemisphere, and it's basically divided in 4 different parts. So we have the occipital, parietal, frontal, and temporal lobe. And here in the temporal lobe is where the sounds that comes from your ears actually reach the cortex. So here's where the auditory processing starts. And here, this line that actually divides the parietal and the frontal sulcus is called the central sulcus, the frontal lobe. So I mention this because in front of the central sulcus, we have the so-called motor cortex. And behind it, we have the sensory motor cortex. If we cut the brain in this, towards this red line, we see a representation of our body in the motor strip. So this is the part of the cortex that actually control all the motor, all the different parts of the body. But I mentioned this to you because I want to focus in these 2 parts. So basically the trunk and the part of the vocalization. Why? Because this is what is I'm actually controlling right now in order to be able to talk. The traditional view says that this process of speech perception and speech production are completely separate things. So you probably have heard about the Wernicke's aphasia or Broca's aphasia. So one is people that are not able to talk or are not able to understand. So this is the traditional view, but the evidence points towards something slightly different. Maybe they are seems to be more connected. But how can we actually better understand speech perception? So we need a method that actually entitle us to have a really high temporal resolution and a really high spatial resolution. In most of the cases, we have only one of those. We have something that can measure the time very precisely, or can measure just exactly where something is happening in the brain. But there is one exception. In some patients with epilepsy that do not have response to anti-epileptic medications, this is a really small portion of them, there is a hint that maybe there is a part in the brain that is not functioning correctly. So then there is the opportunity for those patients to be cured, to have no more seizures. But before removing or taking out the part of the brain that is problematic, we need to make sure that this part of the brain actually is not important for speech production or for speech perception. So in order to do that, some electrodes are being implanted in the brain. This is called electrocorticography. And via neurosurgery, the electrodes are being placed on the brain, and these have a really high temporal resolution and really high spatial resolution. So then the patient is actually placed in a hospital room and record for a couple of days. So this allows us actually to have to measure, for example, high frequencies and low frequencies, something that is related with the processing of speech perception. So, but we want to also recover this high spatial resolution. So how do we recover this high spatial resolution? We reconstruct the brains of the patients, and then we look into the CT after the surgery. So here you can see the part of the skull that was taken out in order to put the electrodes. And we identify the three-dimensional coordinates of those electrodes. And we put those electrodes back into the space of the brain of the subject. Okay, so now we have all the tools that we need, but we need also to control what the subject is actually hearing, or what the subject is actually paying attention to. So for that, we ask them to do what is so-called a delay match to sample task. So we present them with syllables, like auditory syllables like ma or pa, which are very basic but are the building blocks of speech. And then we ask them to hear the sounds and then to read some letters. And they have to match which letters are actually were present or not in the sounds. And just press one button out of the two. This is a very simple task, but allows us to process, to study the processing of speech perception. It also allows us to process working memory, reading, and of course the motor response. But here, I'm basically focusing on only the auditory part. So, well, how does it look like? So we found that gamma power is increased in temporal areas. So as I told you at the beginning, so temporal areas are involved in the processing of sound. So this is something we actually expected. And alpha power is decreasing the rest of the brain. So this is in the blue color here. So for example, when we are hearing, where we are paying attention to some sound, we don't need our auditory cortex. So we don't need, we only need our auditory cortex. We don't need our visual cortex. We don't need to process any visual stimuli, only the auditory stimuli. So this is actually deactivated during the perception of the sounds. So then we look into the different properties of the sound. So a sound can actually be divided into acoustic properties or articulatory properties. So what are acoustic properties? So for example, pitch. So if I say hello, and I say hello, so these are different pitch. So these are the different properties of the acoustic properties of the sound. But the sound can also be classified in terms of articulatory properties. So if, for example, I use the lips to pronounce a sound like pa or ma, or if I use the back of my throat to pronounce a sound like ga, for example. So these are the articulatory properties. So we look into these different properties, and we found that these acoustic properties, like the pitch, for example, are represented in temporal areas, as we show in the lateral side, and in the motor areas. So this is what you can see here. So temporal areas are activated, and motor areas are also activated. So this is a bit of a surprise, because usually motor areas are involved in motor movement, so in motor generation, but not in auditory perception. And more importantly, this was actually happening at the same time, so simultaneously. As this is what you can see here. So here are the representation of acoustic properties in the two different areas that you're seeing here, and they actually have the same shape and have a peak at the same time. So the two areas are actually processing the same kind of information at the same time. So just to summarize, I show you that indeed the auditory cortex helps in the processing of auditory stimuli, and the motor areas actually are also activated in the processing of these auditory stimuli. And this is something that kind of changes what we have been used to hear, that these are two completely separate aspects, but indeed your motor cortex, the cortex that the part of your brain that uses for the movement, is also helping you to process the auditory stimuli or the voices that you are hearing. And yeah, with that I would like to thank for your attention, and yeah, thank you.